Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
Sorry, just as it started, I had a massive sneeze, so I apologize.
No, it's good. It's good. It humanizes you. It reminds everyone that we are like the pirates skiff in the ocean, sailing along, not simply soulless robots. And of course, we also have Sara Gon. Sara, how are you?
I'm very well. Nice, warm weather, lovely.
Yes, no, it's after the miserable cold that we just had up in Joburg. But I suspect that, we are headed for the coldness of midwinter. Anyway, let's start off with our first story today. And this is about South Africa's most beloved minister, or perhaps not, our tourism minister, Minister Lindiwe Sisulu. So she's been appearing quite a lot in the media recently as part of this there's this rumors that the sort of Zuma anti-Cyril faction might put her up to contest against Cyril for leadership of the ANC. And there was a debate in Parliament this week on the budget of her department, tourism department, which has a budget of about 2.5 billion rand. And as to be expected, considering the absolute devastation that's happened in the tourism sector during the COVID pandemic. Of course, I remember there was that attempt to confine COVID relief to only BEE compliant tourist enterprises, which was a complete disaster. And so, as to be expected, opposition MPs took a lot of shots at her in that budget debate. The DA MP Manny de Freitas, for example, was quoted saying, "This government still doesn't understand that it is the private sector that is actually building tourism and bringing visitors to South Africa. This is happening while the government tinkers on the edges." Sisulu, in her response, however, said something I think that is very much worth taking into account. She said the following, quote, "We are talking about a very fragile and important sector of our economy. I have listened to some of the inputs from various members, and what I find shocking is the lack of patriotism, a lack of empathy for those people who have given of themselves to be able to provide a living for themselves and other people in this particular industry." Now, this unsettles me very much, and it's not the first time we've seen criticism like this leveled at opposition MPs. I think it actually may even have started back in the Mbeki years. The claim that opposition MPs are being unpatriotic when they criticize government policy. Marius, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it's one of those things that happens in a lot of countries. People, especially ones that you wouldn't really consider democratic, where people, any criticism of the government is seen as unpatriotic, and that's often used to shut down criticism. I think this is exactly it. That wouldn't be, that's just a way of shutting down any criticisms, not dealing with the issues and what have you. And Lindiwe Sisulu, she's somebody who, the longer she remains in public eye, you take her less and less seriously. I mean, just a little while ago, when she started her campaign now to challenge Cyril Ramaphosa, she was inspecting a guard of MK veterans, and it was actually just so cringeworthy. I mean, there was she was wearing like a camo uniform with and a camo cap, but she was wearing high heels at the same time, and also the MK veterans, they're not. I mean, they're not like I don't know what's the word. They don't drill like these very well trained soldiers. Like they you can see they all like kind of old guys, and their uniforms don't really match and whatever. And it wasn't very impressive. And so obviously she's trying to do some kind of photo op, but it was actually, in respect to actually less. And it wasn't great. But also, I mean, the same thing with Lindiwe Sisulu. She doesn't really have any kind of personal ideology that drives what she does. I mean, she was Cyril Ramaphosa's running mate in the national conference in 2017, and now she's going up against him. And it's not. She doesn't really seem to have much of a different policy offering from the president. You got to ask yourself, if she was his running mate in 2017, why suddenly is she think he's doing such a bad job that she wants to?
Right. This sort of seems to be a bit of a pattern for the ANC, right? I'm pretty sure Kgatlana Motlanthe originally ran alongside Zuma, and then Cyril ran alongside Zuma, and then of course.
Well, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is a great example, I think. In 2007, she was Thabo Mbeki's running mate to keep out against the Zumaites in the party. Then 10 years later, she was running on the Zuma ticket.
Right.
So there's no real, there's no real policy issues why people run. I think it's all about trying to get your hands on as much patronage as possible. And yeah, but I mean, just to conclude,
as former President Thabo Mbeki himself said, he agreed with that.
Exactly.
Point. Exactly.
Oh, but I mean, I think that also happens to any big party like the NC that's been in power for quite long. After a while, its reason for existing is just to dole out patronage. And I think that's what's happening with the NC and why it's starting to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. I mean, I'm going off on a bit of tangent now, but I wouldn't be surprised that if in 10 years' time, there's no NC on the ballot paper anymore in South Africa. I don't think it's impossible to say that. But yeah, but overall, I mean, I don't think Sisulu has covered herself in glory yet. She hasn't addressed any of the comments made to her, I think it was from Manny de Freitas, and just, criticized him saying he's unpatriotic. And and that's a dangerous part to go down. You can criticize the government at any time, doesn't make you unpatriotic.
Sarah, your thoughts? I'm of course reminded of a cliche in liberal circles, which is that this Helen Suzman quote from during the National Party years, where she was accused of embarrassing the government with her questions, and she said, "No, I'm not embarrassing the government with my questions. It's your answers that are embarrassing you."
And it also brings to mind, and sorry, I've forgotten the exact phrase, but isn't patriotism the last refuge of the scoundrel or something
Indeed.
to that effect? Yeah. And she, Nduli Sisulu, I think there's a sort of hubris there because she's what's considered struggle royalty, her father famous, her brother was well known. And I think she's got a certain sense of entitlement, but she doesn't necessarily have the skills or insight to meet that sense of entitlement. I mean, she's held a number of portfolios. I think the problem here is that you can, as I said earlier, it's a sort of statement you make. It's a bit like answering a question with a question. It's just insulting, but it doesn't tell you anything at all. But you're left with the impression that she hasn't been in the portfolio for that long, but they haven't really done anything. As you say, the industry was, completely decimated. But the problem it presents is it's an industry that is largely a creature of the private sector, and it deals extensively with small business, which theoretically is ideally what government should give assistance to, but it cannot assist and manage it. It's not in its sphere of expertise, and given how badly it was affected, whatever help could have been given should have started being given a long time ago. And this discrepancy between helping black-owned businesses and not white-owned businesses, but not taking into account the number of black people that may be employed by white owners, it's just part of that sort of nasty, thoughtless stuff that the government indulges in. And this was supposed to be one of the industries, together with agriculture, that is meant to help drag South Africa out of the mire. And it's not. But I think it's really reflective of this thin-skinned, prickly personality of the person.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. And of course, tourism is a great industry for us because it produces a lot of jobs for people who don't have great education or lots of skills.
Yeah.
Which is sorely needed in South Africa because of the state of our education system.
Yeah.
Anyway, let us move on to our next story. And this is an old favorite of ours, or not a favorite, to be more accurate, and that is that President Cyril Ramaphosa has said in response to questions in Parliament that he is not going to be disbanding the National Coronavirus Command Council, despite the fact that the effects of COVID-19 are very quickly ebbing away. At least the disease effects, the economic effects remain. He said that the NCCC, the NCCC, continues to perform this function since although the national state of disaster has been lifted, the COVID-19 pandemic is unfortunately not yet over. As a cabinet committee, which like all other cabinet committees was established to support the work of cabinet in whatever form the executive deems most practical or useful, the existence of the NCCC is not dependent on the national state of disaster being in operation. So, at least he's sort of trying to place what exactly this thing is, because it's been kept quite mysterious for a lot of time, and it seems to have power beyond what is simply the cabinet. But anyway, This is despite the fact that that we are in the 5th wave of COVID infections now, and yet hospitalizations have remained relatively low. A lot of people have either sort of vaccine immunity or more commonly natural immunity because they've had COVID already. And so the threat to the country's healthcare system is vastly diminished. In fact, there seems to be data that's come out of both the UK and South Africa, which suggests that COVID is now less of a threat to the average person than the normal flu is, or the regular flu that we get every year. So, of course, the question remains, and Sara, I'll start with you. Why is government keeping the NCCC alive?
It must be a power kick, because they've got a Department of Health, which takes a huge amount of our budget. What they do with it is another matter. But they should be able to deal with a pandemic that is probably fast losing its pandemic status, since it's clear that the sort of normal flu season has kicked in and is overtaking COVID in terms of hospitalizations and death. There's no justification other than, well, we want to keep this going because we want to keep it going. I mean, there's no reason why the cabinet should need the assistance of the council. As I said, we have one of the largest cabinets in the world. It's got ministers, it's got deputy ministers, it's got DGs. We've got a health department, we've got provincial health departments. If they can't manage it at this point, they shouldn't be there, which may be the case. They probably shouldn't be there. But the point is that that's what they are there for, and that's what they should be doing. And there's no justification, to my mind, to continue the command council on any basis whatsoever. There are too many other, shall we say, ordinary structures in place that should well be able to deal with it and give proper accountability to Parliament and to South Africans as a result.
Marius, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense to still have the thing. I was just looking at the COVID-19 numbers now for South Africa, and this 5th wave is not even really a wave. It's more of a splash. I mean, we're already on the way out of, numbers are already declining, and it's, I mean, maybe half of what the first wave was, which was our, least the dangerous wave out of the 4 previous waves we've had. So it doesn't make any sense to still have it. COVID-19 is pretty much done now, I think, in the whole world, and South Africa, I don't think it's an exception. Most people have either, as you said, Nick, have
well, except China, apparently.
China and North Korea.
Yeah, but I mean, they also they try to go for zero COVID, which is impossible. You're playing a mugs game. Even a place like New Zealand, which is small, quite isolated, pretty well run, they couldn't even do zero COVID. So especially in a place like China, over 1 billion people, quite interconnected with the rest of the world, you're never going to do zero COVID. I mean, so the best thing to do, I think, is get as many people vaccinated as possible. And also, most people have had COVID now. I mean, I think in South Africa this is a couple of months ago, about 80% of people already had COVID. So, I think it's time now, it's an endemic disease now in South Africa. Most people, as I say, have been vaccinated, are protected from it. So I don't think it really makes much sense to have the NCCC still in place. And I think it's, I've made this point before. I think it's kind of the government cosplaying actually running the country. They do all these kinds of things that, they tell us about this huge flag for 22 million rand they're going to build. They're going to keep this NCCC in place. But they're not actually doing the hard work of actually, for example, fixing hospitals. I mean, there was a story recently where people were starving in government hospitals because it's just run so badly, nobody's getting any food. Or, I mean, any person who lives in South Africa can see the potholes in the roads, degradation of infrastructure. That's the hard stuff to do. It's the hard stuff to actually fix things and maintain infrastructure and get the economy going. It's much easier to say, cool, we're going to build a bullet train, or we're going to build this massive flag, or build, Fikile and Balula said the other day they're going to start building charging stations for electric vehicles. That's a pity.
With what electricity?
Exactly. You can't even, rather make sure that the roads are in good shape and start fixing the existing railway system instead of building charging stations for, Teslas, which 99.99999% of South Africans can't even dream of affording one day.
Maybe Elon Musk will give us huge discounts because we're South Africans.
I somehow doubt it. Yeah, it's just bad politics. Never mind the sort of governance aspect of it. It's just, this is not something that's going to win you much support, except for people who are just sort of completely disconnected from the real world. But anyway, right. So let's move on to our next story. And this is a topic which I don't know if we've talked about too much before, maybe a little bit on the show. And this is I think people's disappointment with RDP houses. So RDP houses have been, I think, a bit of in many ways a success, but in many ways also a failure for South Africa's governance record. At least until the end of the Mbeki presidency, until sort of 2011, we did see the number of people living in shacks decrease. Lots of RDP houses have been rolled out across the country, but because of the lack of economic growth, a lot of people still require RDP houses. They aren't able to afford their own. They aren't able to go and get bond houses. And so we really are kind of trying to hold back the sea, I think, in some ways. And we've seen things like the number of people living in shacks and stuff begin to increase in recent years. And there's a story from it was put in Eyewitness News where they went and interviewed some residents of a place in Savannah City in the south of Joburg, who said they lived in these poorly built RDP houses. Some have caved in ceilings, some have no electricity for more than 3 years. They interviewed one guy who had been looking forward to, his old guy, he's in his 60s, or almost in his 60s, looking forward to living in his dream home, an RDP house. But he said the one that he was finally given is in terrible state. Visible watermarks along his kitchen wall, poor design, workmanship, leaks all over the house. He said, quote, "These houses are rotting, just like those other ones. The water flows to the front one side and eats away the plastering. It's rotting all over the floor." He says he's not really bothered by load shedding because he doesn't have electricity. And as a result, he has to buy fresh food every day because he can't plug in the fridge that he owns because there's no electricity. So it always annoys him. And of course, he also went on to say that before he was moved to this RDP house, he had electricity and he didn't use paraffin lamps. But now that he's in an RDP house, which is supposed to have services, he's been forced to use paraffin lamps. And he says that it's affecting his respiratory health. Other people in this area say that they have had no electricity or geysers installed in their houses since 2019 when they were moved there. And this is not an isolated incident by any means. I remember in 2012, I went to a RDP settlement on the outskirts of Port St. John's, which had been built so far from the town that because no one there could afford a car. There was very little transport infrastructure, not even taxis. So people said, well, I'm going to rather live in a shack closer to the town where I can maybe get some work than live in these RDP houses, which are too far away. Also, they hadn't had any toilets installed. And they were all built on a slope and flooded regularly. Girls who were walking to school along from that RDP settlement, young girls, teenage girls, were attacked and raped often because it was such a long walk. And I think this is fairly emblematic, unfortunately, of the way that RDP houses have been rolled out across a lot of the country. And this is somewhat hidden in the stats, is yes, a lot have been built, but a lot have been built very badly. Sarah, what do you make of this?
As you say, this is an old story, and it's usually been a combination of poor design and implementation, kickbacks, because the people who've got the contracts have not been adequately skilled to do so, but obviously there's money going to a middleman, etc., etc. And I think there's another awful element of it, is that the expectation of an RDP house. I mean, no one expects very much, but certainly in the last decade or more, the instances of this sort of ramshackle state of RDP housing has increased. And I think what probably plays into it to some extent is that, people are given an RDP house when they sort of passive receivers of the house. They don't have a substantial stake in the house, and they can't necessarily afford to repair it if it needs repair. And an idea that I still think has merit is the site and service idea, where you provide the services needed. You provide the sites and you let people do their own thing. They then become responsible for the house they build or the improvements they make, and it builds over time. But as soon as you've got sort of the government doing it with third parties that it has contracted on often nefarious grounds, it's an absolute disaster. And you're literally seeing, to pardon the expression, a dream deferred.
Right. And I think, we really do have to ask the question of how sustainable is the RDP project? because without that economic growth, Marius, I mean, we're never going to get everyone in the country housed.
No, exactly. And I see there's a comment here from Christu Zondag. RDP planning is indistinguishable from apartheid spatial planning. And I think he's spot on there. A lot of these RDP houses are built far from economic opportunities. People spend half their salary just getting to a job or whatever the case is. And that is one of the things, I mean, on face value, one of the successes of the ANC government has been to build quite a lot of housing and provide people with services. But I mean, as we were just saying, a lot of these houses are poorly built. They're built far from, economic opportunities or schools if people have kids and whatever you. And we've actually seen this also in, but a lot of people actually they will go and make sure they live closer to economic opportunities, and they're prepared then to live in a shack and worse living conditions. What we've seen also in mining communities, a lot of the miners, they'll get an offer of the mine of giving them housing, and it'll be quite a nice house or in the hostel or whatever. A lot of these guys will actually prefer to go live in a shack, and then they get the living out allowance, and then they're getting whatever extra 2,000 or 3,000 rand a month in their salary. So a lot of these guys actually prefer to do that, and you can't blame the guy. He's making a decision for himself. That's optimum decision for him, as he's determined it. He wants to send more money home or whatever the case is. So good for him. So, but I think that is one thing where we have to look at. That is still one legacy we have in our cities. Obviously, they're not nearly as segregated as they were, but poorer people are definitely still put on the margins. And then even when people do move into close to economic opportunities, then places aren't serviced. A lot of flats turn into slums and so on. I mean, all three of us are from Joburg, so we've all seen what's happened in some parts of Joburg. Especially the CBD parts of the CBD. Louis Botha Avenue in Joburg is also a case of that to a degree. A lot of degradation of the infrastructure and housing not being looked after. So that's something that the government has to look at. And also, I mean, there's things like building hijacking and whatever. That's also a problem. So overall, I mean, I think we do have to give kudos to the ANC government to a degree. They have provided housing for people, but they've also been, as with anything like this, it's always a bit more complicated. And doesn't help if you give 100,000 people a decent home and it's 50 k's away from the nearest job or nearest school or whatever the case is.
Right. No, and I think this is in a lot of ways the RDP housing has been a little bit of a salve over the deeper problems of unemployment, of bad crime, of poor transport infrastructure, and I think it's brought the ANC quite a lot of goodwill. But as it turns out, that if your economy is growing slower than your population, then you're not really going to get anywhere. Sorry, any final thoughts?
No, just to respond to the comment that there may not be enough bribe money to go around, and I think that's exactly why Marius's perhaps hopeful comments that we won't see the ANC on a ballot after 2029 is because the bribe money is running out, and they just didn't learn the lesson. If you want to build lots of houses for people, bribe a bit, but still do the job, and people will pay less attention and concern for the bribes.
All right, let's move on to our next story, and this is one about culture. So MultiChoice is making a big deal about they've begun filming for their new historical drama series, which I believe is called Shaka Zulu, and the filming has begun in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. They expect it to provide at least 8,000 jobs while the filming is going on. This series is set in the 1700s and tells the origin story of Shaka Zulu, the founder of the Zulu nation, from his early childhood through to adulthood. The production has been 6 years in the making, and apparently they've consulted historians, academics, family descendants, the previous Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi for their input on how they're going to actually write the show. They also say, of course, that they're going to balance the show's historical aspects with making it a little bit more dramatic and fit for TV. So I think this is really good. I've been very annoyed by, particularly in the sort of global pop culture over the last few years, that there's been all these very pathetic, weak attempts to kind of force inclusivity into things that are really kind of shallow. There's always like, oh, we're gonna make a black Superman or a gay Batman or something like that, and it's always just a kind of sop to the sort of in crowd, but without actually telling new or interesting stories. Which is one point of the sort of woke agenda I actually agree with, is that there should be a space in the culture to tell completely new stories from completely new perspectives. And I think South Africa's history is really fascinating and really dramatic, and there are plenty of awesome stories to tell in it, and that there's a lot of opportunity. Now, for my part, I think the Shaka Zulu story is probably going to do quite well, and of course, I'm sure most of us remember, even if we didn't see it at the time, we probably saw it afterwards, the famous, I think it was an SABC produced Shaka's TV series that everyone remembers the theme song of, and that apparently was watched by like everyone in South Africa at one point. And so, the story of Shaka Zulu, it's a little bit, I think, overwrought. I would prefer to see something about like the founder of the Sotho nation, Moshoeshoe. Still, I think this is great. I think it's an interesting South African story to be told about a really dramatic and fascinating part of history that has enchanted people from all over the world. And I hope that the series is good. I am a little bit skeptical because very often historical series, they say, oh, yeah, no, we consulted all these historical people, and then they completely ignore them and write some dreck. Whereas I think the actual history is often quite fascinating. It doesn't need too much pampering up to make it good for TV. But I don't know. Marius, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. And I think if we can especially do well overseas, get people interested in South African history and South Africa. But I think there's also a point to be made, as what you're talking about, new stories. I can't remember the exact stats, but something like, I don't know, 90% of the top grossing movies of the 21st century are from franchises or remakes or whatever the case is. Very few new stories are actually getting told.
It's a big problem in Hollywood at the moment.
And I don't know if that's because Hollywood producers or whatever, you don't want to take a chance on a new story, or if audiences are just getting stuck in their ways. I mean, look, I'll be honest, I like the Marvel movies and whatever, but they do get a bit samey after a while, and sometimes you want a different kind of story. But obviously, I hope this Shaka story does pretty well. As you're saying before the show, I think South Africa's history in the 1800s, I think it's a really fascinating time. As you said, it's very similar to the Old West. And there's also, it really shaped, obviously, not just South African history, but Southern African history, and people like, so many interesting characters from that time, as you were saying, Shaka, Mzilikazi, Moshoeshoe, Cecil John Rhodes, Paul Kruger. You can tell stories about the Great Trek, or, how the Sotho under Moshoeshoe resisted British. Exactly, and the Griquas, and how they resisted British colonialism and all that kind of thing. So you can tell it from different kinds of perspectives. And it's just a very interesting time, and I think even world history. And I think there's lots of stories that'll come out there, and hopefully the Shaka series can sort of be a tinder for some more interesting stories coming out of South Africa and Southern Africa as well.
Yeah, I do. I am also hoping that the series won't focus too much on something like colonialism. I think that, of the historical dramas we do have, a lot of it focuses on apartheid, colonialism, the legacy of apartheid, these things. And I would like to see a historical drama that is told about African history, which isn't through the prism or the lens of oppression. It'd be more interesting to see, good old sort of people stabbing each other and sex and betrayal and that kind of stuff. Game of Thrones, South Africa is, I think, what I hope this turns out to be. But Sara, I guess the bottom line is, I just hope it's good.
No, look, South Africa is capable of making good series and good films. It's proven as such, and I believe apparently there are 11 South African films on the market at Cannes at the moment. The advantage, I guess, for this is to have relatively broad appeal. It's a story people know to some extent, if not completely, and it's dramatic. If they could, with a bit of artistic license, stick to the history, good or bad, and make it something that people want to watch every week, or however often it's run, no problem at all. I agree with you. I think it would be nice to sort of expand a little bit of the history. I think it would, if done properly, it gives a better understanding of the complexity of South African history and the different characters that that this country has had, good and bad, from all races, colonial or otherwise. If it is good and it is popular and it's properly done, more power to the elbow. But we certainly can tell stories. Sometimes small, sort of almost small stories, quiet stories, but we do them well. But appealing to a larger audience, not a bad idea.
Can I just quickly ask a question, Nick? Sara mentioned the Cannes Film Festival. I want to know if you've gone to Cannes twice. Have you done the Cannes?
God. You should not have let him ask the question.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to shut the show down now. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. I hope that you found the show interesting and enjoyable. And we will, of course, see you next week on the Daily Friends Show. Have a wonderful weekend. Cheers, everyone.